After Newton, the positivists imposed the idea that the purpose of physics was to find the mathematical equations corresponding to experiments. In their totalitarian approach, the positivists, and then the progressives, asserted that all the forces of nature should be unified in a single force, gravitation. Maxwell began by proposing a unification of the electric and magnetic forces carried by an ether, also carrying the light waves. He gave the equations summarizing the corresponding phenomena. This immobile ether filled the entire universe. It was a solid because light can be polarized and therefore has a transverse property. A few years later, Hertz carried out an experiment showing that the waves produced by an electric arc propagate at the speed of light. Maxwell's theory thus received a striking confirmation. Another experiment dealt a terrible blow to Maxwell's ether. Michelson's experiment showed that the Earth has no motion compared to Maxwell's ether, which is solid and motionless. Lorentz therefore imagined that the lengths would get longer and time would slow down with speed. A motion in the motionless ether filling the universe would alter lengths and time. Lorentz's ether replaced Maxwell's. Maxwell's equations were saved. A second blow to Maxwell's system was dealt by Poincaré. The equations that governed the propagation of light in electromagnetic waves were not invariant in a Galilean frame change. Poincaré had imagined that the equations of electromagnetic phenomena should remain identical for two observers moving relative to each other at constant speed. Poincaré's physics dealt only with essential things. Its principle of relativity is absurd in fluids like water and air. One absolutely do not measure the same thing from a bridge over a river as in a boat carried by its current. This is not at all what Poincaré was interested with. It is a question of theoretical physics, of pure science, and in no case of vulgar engineering techniques. A brilliant intuition led Einstein to verify that the Lorentz transformation modifying lengths and time during motions in the ether made it possible to respond to Poincaré's criticism. The Maxwell-Faraday and Maxwell-Hertz equations that govern wave propagation in the motionless Lorentz ether remain the same for all observers moving at constant speed in the Lorentz ether. The Lorentz transformation saved the ether by both explaining Michelson's experiment and fulfilling Poincaré's principle of relativity. Einstein's theory was naturally named theory of relativity. Maxwell's equations were saved. A page of history seems to have been definitively turned. Professor William Thomson, Lord Kelvin, believed that physics was practically complete. There is nothing left to discover in physics today, all that remains is to improve the accuracy of measurements. However, at the very moment when Kelvin imagined the end of science, Planck realized that light is quantized. His famous experiment on black bodies allowed him to affirm that light is made of quanta. Planck thus answered the problem posed by the photoelectric effect discovered by Hertz. The blow was fatal for the ether. No medium was known having properties quantified in this way. Light and electromagnetic waves are therefore carried by corpuscles, photons. Maxwell's equations were still saved. Another stroke of genius brought the solution to this kind of paradox. Louis de Broglie posed the double nature of light, wave and corpuscle. However, how to conceive that corpuscles can produce interferences? It was necessary to add the probability of presence of photons, as waves, but of course localized, as corpuscles, as soon as they are in contact with matter. Another tragedy occurred a few decades after these trying upheavals. Photons emitted in opposite directions remain informed of their polarization state when they arrive at the receiver. They invented quantum entanglement. Yet despite all these upheavals, for more than 150 years, Maxwell's equations emerged unscathed. The multitudes of theories proposed since then remain with the unshakable equations of Maxwell. Maxwell's equations were saved again and again. What professor did not feel a bit embarrassed to point out that the complementary term of the Maxwell-Ampere equation, the famous displacement current, is not based on any experimental fact? This complementary term crystallized all the critics. Nobody imagined that it was just a consequence of another equation, the Maxwell-Faraday equation. Maxwell imagined that the electric current induced in a conductor by a varying magnetic field resulted from an electric field produced by the variation of the magnetic field. The unification of electric and magnetic forces made this idea perfectly plausible. The change from a magnetic field to an electric field occurred in a physical medium that could perhaps be modified in some way. Since the ether has been eradicated, how can it be conceived that the variation of a magnetic field can be transmuted into an electric field? Maxwell's interpretation of Faraday's experiment is completely arbitrary and not based on any experiment. In reality, the variation of the magnetic field acts directly on the electrons of the conductors to produce a current. The Maxwell-Faraday equation only makes sense in conductors. The change in the intrinsic magnetic fields of protons, neutrons, and electrons generates a current in conductors. But then the complementary term of the Maxwell-Ampere equation is also false. The conservation of the charge requires eliminating this term, the displacement current, since the Maxwell-Faraday equation disappears. There is no equation left that would correspond to the propagation of waves in space. Maxwell's whole electromagnetic theory collapses. The Maxwell equations are eradicated. Einstein's theory of special relativity could well be dragged into the turmoil. Because the most serious thing is that Michelson's experiment, repeated thousands of times by Miller, not only does not give entirely negative results, but in addition they are correlated with the respective positions of the Sun, the Earth, and the Moon. The totalitarian vision of the progressives was a dark illusion. This absurd vision was also based on a profound contradiction. The progressives quite rightly proposed an evolution of the universe. But they based this evolution on a multitude of constants that were strictly invariant over billions of light years. Everything evolves, even atoms, everything differentiates, even forces.